Hello from Pensacola, Florida. I'm George Ellenberg, Provost and Professor of History at the University of West Florida. I'm pleased to be able to talk about the rise and the fall of the mule in the American South between 1850 and 1950. The story of the mule is such a rich tale and reflects the close relationship the region has had with agriculture during its history. I will begin with a short excerpt from William Faulkner's book, Sartoris. I think you'll find it fitting. Here is what Faulkner says about the southern mule. Father and mother he does not resemble. Sons and daughters he will never have. Vindictive and patient, it is a known fact that he will labor 10 years willingly and patiently for you for the privilege of kicking you once. Solitary but without pride, self-sufficient but without vanity, his voice is his own derision. Outcast and pariah, he has neither friend, wife, mistress, nor sweetheart. Celibate, he is unscarred, possesses neither pillar nor desert cave. He is not assaulted by temptations, nor flagellated by dreams, nor assuaged by vision. Faith, hope, and charity are not his. Here is an overview of the major points of the research behind my book on mule use in the American South, the rise of mules as the most important draft animal in the region, and the shift to mechanized agriculture which led to the end of mule use in the 1950s. You can see here the key points of my presentation. First, I'll define the mule and define the geographic region that I refer to as the South. Next, plantation owners were the first to adopt mules since they considered mules as innovative and well-suited to the region and to slave-based cotton production. Mules became the premier draft animals in the American South by 1850. Then, after the American Civil War, mules continued to be the most important draft animal in the American South as tenancy and sharecropping replaced slavery. Interestingly, Midwestern mechanization prompted a debate between draft animal and tractor proponents in the 1920s and 1930s that affected the southern mule supply. Next, mule use declined rapidly after World War II with the development of a mechanical cotton picker. And finally, mules became an integral part of the region's culture and had great symbolic power. Most of you are aware of what a mule is, of course, but I want to touch on that point for the purpose of this presentation. The mule is a hybrid animal. It's a cross between a mare, and you see a photograph of a mare and her mule colt on the left side of the slide, and a jack pictured on the right. In a sense, the mule is a scientifically engineered animal, a point that I will return to later on in the presentation. Of course, a mule gets attributes from both the mare and the jack. The mule typically gets its size from the mare, while the large ears, small feet, sure-footedness, and voice come from the jack. There are other attributes as well, but these, generally speaking, are what people think about when they think of mules. The relationship of the mule to the landscape and mindscape of the American South is complex on many levels. Inextricably linked to slavery, tenancy, and sharecropping, the mule represents both positive and negative aspects of agriculture in the region, from prosperity to poverty. Now that I have defined the mule, I want to give you an idea of the region of the United States that I focused on in my research. Pictured here is an 1861 map that provides a good sense of the American South before the American Civil War. The major cotton-producing states are in the Deep South, most importantly South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Cotton was produced in other states as well, especially during the 20th century, but for my purposes, the states listed are a good geographical reference point. The states around the South, known as the border states, such as Tennessee and Kentucky, supplied mules to cotton growers because landowners did not raise their own mules. This dependency on external breeders caused its own set of problems, but landowners chose not to keep jacks for breeding purposes since there was no other use for that animal in the region. Mules were not the only draft animal used in the South, but they did far outnumber other types of draft animals. Beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, large landowners planters began discussing what draft animal was best suited for the South. Horses, mules, and oxen were the three options that were debated, sometimes even fiercely, in print. The conclusions were that oxen were dependable but slow, horses were faster than oxen but not able to endure the heat of the region very well, and they were expensive to feed. So by 1850, the mule was established as the predominant draft animal in the American South. One key point is that as hybrids, mules were, in a sense, a product of scientific agriculture. In the decades before the American Civil War, the South came under more and more criticism for its use of slavery in a nation that was forward-looking and innovative. In the political and social environment of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, Southerners could argue that slavery could exist in step with a forward-looking, energetic North that believed in free, not slave labor. The irony is that mule use strengthened slavery. If it had not, slaveholders probably would not have begun using mules. At the time of the ascendancy of the mule in Southern agriculture as the premier draft animal, its demise was perhaps already a given, a slow casualty of civil war and the end of slavery, the poverty of tenancy and sharecropping, and ultimately of mechanization. One significant economic drawback in regard to mules that I mentioned earlier was that mules could not reproduce. Areas outside the Cotton South were more than capable of supplying mules, however, and plantation owners were willing to pay the extra costs related to breeding and shipping mules so that they would not have to keep a jack on hand. An active mule trade grew up and existed between states such as Kentucky and Tennessee, which had suitable pastures for grazing the jacks, mares, and young mules, and the cotton-producing areas. This supply line was important to cotton since very few plantation owners and even fewer small landowners owned jacks, nor did they desire to do so. Mules were seen as uniquely suited to plantation agriculture, and that remained true after the American Civil War. They were hardy, their small feet did not damage the cotton plants, and they were seen as somewhat self-sufficient. It was said that you could work a horse to death, but that a mule would not work beyond its limits. Thus, the mule's reputation for stubbornness proved a benefit to the landowner. In the aftermath of the American Civil War, slavery itself as an institution in the South was destroyed, but cotton agriculture increased with a new form of labor relations, tenancy and sharecropping. Although tenancy and sharecropping proved to be the norm on post-war farms for both African American and white farmers, there were some large plantations that moved away from sharecropping, consolidated their operations, and used day laborers instead of permanent residents on their land. This was a fundamental shift in labor relations on those plantations. And there's yet another wrinkle in this story. Overproduction of cotton resulting in low cotton prices was a chronic problem in the South. In response to low cotton prices, farmers of all types would grow more cotton the next year, and the cycle locked the South into a downward spiral that was only made more of a problem by the Great Depression. To combat this trend, Depression-era government programs, overseen by the United States Department of Agriculture, set up programs to take cotton land out of production by paying farmers not to grow cotton. Landowners, not tenants or sharecroppers, received this funding and sometimes used these payments to take the least productive land out of production and or to purchase tractors and other equipment that led to tenants and sharecroppers being ejected from farms. I have to tell one humorous story about the first year of these programs. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933, the cotton crop was already planted. Upon implementation of the Cotton Reduction Program, huge acres of cotton had to be plowed to limit production that year. In later years, fewer acres would be planted, but the nation was in crisis in 1933. All their lives, mules had been punished if they stepped on cotton plants. But in 1933, they had to walk right down that cotton row. It was said that the psychological damage to mules across the South was immense. The one area that prevented the mechanization of cotton production was the labor-intensive process of picking the crop. As long as landowners needed a large supply of labor to pick the cotton crop, there was a disincentive to mechanize. Indeed, a viable mechanical cotton picker was not developed until the 1940s. As a result of late mechanization, the system of tenancy and sharecropping remained the key for cotton production into the 1950s. This photo depicts in the foreground one farmer moving into the future, and in the background, one tied to the past. Tractors could do the work more efficiently, but they were expensive, they required fuel and other off-farm inputs, and continual maintenance. They also required landowners to take out loans to pay for the equipment. Even so, it was not unusual during this time of transition to see both mules and tractors working the land at the same time. The mechanical cotton picker was the final piece of the puzzle in fully mechanizing cotton production. Now, the large number of hands that were once needed to pick the cotton crop were no longer required. Mules could be replaced by tractors, farmers could consolidate their holdings, and thus tenants and sharecroppers were displaced from the land, even as World War II also pulled many thousands from southern fields to either serve in the military or to work in war industries. These shifts spelled the end of what I call the Mule South. I do want to touch briefly on the importance of the mule as a cultural icon, certainly in the context of the American South, and the mule's unique and complicated link to land, slavery, tenancy, and sharecropping. The center photograph is the funeral procession of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968. Significantly, the sharecropper's wagon in which his coffin is pulled is being drawn by two mules, Ada and Agnes. The mule is symbolic of so much in the American South that's profoundly evidenced here. To the plantation owner in 1850, the mule signified scientific agriculture and innovation. By 1950, to many who observed the region, the mule represented much that was wrong with the region and was symbolic of a place and time exhausted by its own history. The story of the mule has much to tell us about the American South. I'll close with these two photographs of mules, both on the farm and in town. Mules often became a member of the family, they were part of the economic livelihood of the community, and they were woven into Southern culture. As a symbol of Southern culture and agriculture, the mule as metaphor is complex. The mule became a fundamental part of the rich and varied cloth of the American South. One writer said of the South that, quote, "We believe in tangible things, in abstract thought, but in tangible things, in faith, in love, in cotton bales, in acres of land, in mules." For a century in the American South, the mule enabled farmers large and small to wrest a living from the land in both prosperity and poverty until mules disappeared from southern fields, having left its hoofprints on the region's sometimes tortured history.